thunder and lightning crash above a Scottish moor. Three haggard old women, the witches, appear out of the storm. In eerie, chanting tones, they make plans to meet again upon the heath, after the battle, to confront Macbeth. As quickly as they arrive, they disappear. At a military camp near his palace at Forres, King Duncan of Scotland asks a wounded captain for news about the Scots' battle with the Irish invaders, who are led by the rebel MacDonald. The captain, who was wounded helping Duncan's son Malcolm escape capture by the Irish, replies that the Scottish generals Macbeth and Banquo fought with great courage and violence. The captain then describes to Duncan how Macbeth slew the traitorous MacDonald. As the captain is carried off to have his wounds attended to, the Thane of Ross, a Scottish nobleman, enters and tells the king that the traitorous Thane of Cawdor has been defeated and the army of Norway repelled. Duncan decrees that the Thane of Cawdor is put to death and that Macbeth, the hero of the victorious army, be given Cawdor's title. Ross leaves to deliver the news to Macbeth. On the heath near the battlefield, thunder rolls, and the three witches appear. One says that she has just come from killing swine, and another describes the revenge she has planned upon a sailor whose wife refused to share her chestnuts. Suddenly a drum beats and the third witch cries that Macbeth is coming. Macbeth and Banquo, on their way to the king's court at Forres, come upon the witches and shrink in horror at the sight of the old women. Banquo asks whether they are mortal, noting that they don't seem to be inhabitants of the earth. January 3, 1939. He also wonders whether they are women since they seem to have beards like men. The witches hail Macbeth as Thane of Glamis, his original title, and as Thane of Cawdor. Macbeth is baffled by this second title, as he has not yet heard of King Duncan's decision. The witches also declare that Macbeth will be king one day. Stunned and intrigued, Macbeth presses the witches for more information, but they have turned their attention to Banquo, speaking in yet more riddles. They call Banquo lesser than Macbeth, and greater, and not so happy, yet much happier than. They tell him that he will never be king but that his children will sit upon the throne. 1.3.63a65. Macbeth implores the witches to explain what they meant by calling him Thane of Cawdor, but they vanish into thin air. In disbelief, Macbeth and Banquo discuss this strange encounter. Macbeth fixates on the details of the prophecy. "Your children shall be kings," he says to his friend, to which Banquo responds, "You shall be king." January 3, 1984. Their conversation is interrupted by the arrival of Ross and Angus, who have come to convey them to the king. Ross tells Macbeth that the king has made him Thane of Cawdor, as the former Thane is to be executed for treason. Macbeth, amazed that the witch's prophecy has come true, asks Banquo if he hopes his children will be kings. Banquo replies that devils often tell half-truths to win us to our harm. 1.3.121. Macbeth ignores his companions and speaks to himself, ruminating upon the possibility that he might one day be king. He wonders whether the rain will simply fall to him or whether he will have to perform a dark deed to gain the crown. At last, he shakes himself from his reverie and the group departs for Forres. As they leave, Macbeth whispers to Banquo that, at a later time, he would like to speak to him privately about what has transpired. At the king's palace, Duncan hears reports of Cawdor's execution from his son Malcolm, who says that Cawdor died nobly, confessing freely and repenting of his crimes. Macbeth and Banquo enter with Ross and Angus. Duncan thanks the two generals profusely for their heroism in the battle, and they profess their loyalty and gratitude toward Duncan. Duncan announces his intention to name Malcolm the heir to his throne. Macbeth declares his joy but notes to himself that Malcolm now stands between him and the crown. Plans are made for Duncan to dine at Macbeth's castle that evening, and Macbeth goes on ahead of the royal party to inform his wife of the king's impending arrival. In Inverness, Macbeth's castle, Lady Macbeth reads to herself a letter she has received from Macbeth. The letter announces Macbeth's promotion to the Thaneship of Cawdor and details his meeting with the witches. Lady Macbeth murmurs that she knows Macbeth is ambitious, but fears he is too full of the milk of human kindness to take the steps necessary to make himself king. January 5, 2015. She resolves to convince her husband to do whatever is required to seize the crown. A messenger enters and informs Lady Macbeth that the king rides toward the castle and that Macbeth is on his way as well. As she awaits her husband's arrival, she delivers a famous speech in which she begs, "You spirits, that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty." 1.5.38a41. She resolves to put her natural femininity aside so that she can do the bloody deeds necessary to seize the crown. Macbeth enters, and he and his wife discuss the king's forthcoming visit. Macbeth tells his wife that Duncan plans to depart the next day, but Lady Macbeth declares that the king will never see him tomorrow. She tells her husband to have patience and to leave the plan to her. Duncan, the Scottish lords, and their attendants arrive outside Macbeth's castle. Duncan praises the castle's pleasant environment, and he thanks Lady Macbeth, who has emerged to greet him, for her hospitality. She replies that she must be hospitable since she and her husband owe so much to their king. Duncan then asks to be taken inside to Macbeth, whom he professes to love dearly. Inside the castle, as all bells play and servants set a table for the evening's feast, Macbeth paces by himself, pondering his idea of assassinating Duncan. He says that the deed would be easy if he could be sure that it would not set in motion a series of terrible consequences. He declares his willingness to risk eternal damnation but realizes that even on earth, bloody actions return to plague the inventor. 1.7.9a10. He then considers why he ought not to kill Duncan. Macbeth is Duncan's kinsman, subject, and host. Moreover, the king is universally admired as a virtuous ruler. Macbeth notes that these circumstances offer him nothing that he can use to motivate himself. He faces the fact that there is no reason to kill the king other than his ambition, which he realizes is an unreliable guide. Lady Macbeth enters and tells her husband that the king has dined and that he has been asking for Macbeth. Macbeth declares that he no longer intends to kill Duncan. Lady Macbeth, outraged, calls him a coward and questions his manhood. "When you durst do it," she says, "then you were a man." January 7, 1949. He asks her what will happen if they fail. She promises that as long as they are bold, they will be successful. Then she tells him her plan. While Duncan sleeps, she will give his chamberlains wine to make them drunk, and then she and Macbeth can slip in and murder Duncan. They will smear the blood of Duncan on the sleeping chamberlains to cast the guilt upon them. Astonished at the brilliance and daring of her plan, Macbeth tells his wife that her undaunted mettle makes him hope that she will only give birth to male children. January 7, 1973. He then agrees to proceed with the murder. Banquo and his son Flance walk in the torchlit hall of Macbeth's castle. Flance says that it is after midnight, and his father responds that although he is tired, he wishes to stay awake because his sleep has lately inspired cursed thoughts. 2.1.8. Macbeth enters, and Banquo is surprised to see him still up. Banquo says that the king is asleep and mentions that he had a dream about the three-word sisters. When Banquo suggests that the witches have revealed some truth to Macbeth, Macbeth claims that he has not thought of them at all since their encounter in the woods. 2.1.19a20. He and Banquo agree to discuss the witches' prophecies at a later time. Banquo and Flance leave, and suddenly, in the darkened hall, Macbeth has a vision of a dagger floating in the air before him, its handle pointing toward his hand and its tip aiming him toward Duncan. Macbeth tries to grasp the weapon and fails. He wonders whether what he sees is real or a dagger of the mind, a false creation, proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain. 2.1.38a39. Continuing to gaze upon the dagger, he thinks he sees blood on the blade, then abruptly decides that the vision is just a manifestation of his unease over killing Duncan. The night around him seems thick with horror and witchcraft, but Macbeth stiffens and resolves to do his bloody work. A bell tolls a Lady Macbeth signal that the chamberlains are asleep, and Macbeth strides toward Duncan's chamber. As Macbeth leaves the hall, Lady Macbeth enters, remarking on her boldness. She imagines that Macbeth is killing the king even as she speaks. Hearing Macbeth cry out, she worries that the chamberlains have awakened. She says that she cannot understand how Macbeth could fail as she had prepared the daggers for the chamberlains herself. She asserts that she would have killed the king herself then and there, Had he not resembled her father as he slept? 2:2.12a13. Macbeth emerges, his hands covered in blood, and says that the deed is done. Badly shaken, he remarks that he heard the chamberlains awake and say their prayers before going back to sleep. When they said amen, he tried to say it with them but found that the words stuck in his throat. He adds that as he killed the king, he heard a voice cry, "Sleep no more." Macbeth is murder sleep. 2:2.33a34. Lady Macbeth at first tries to steady her husband, but she becomes angry when she notices that he has forgotten to leave the daggers with the sleeping chamberlains to frame them for Duncan's murder. He refuses to go back into the room, so she takes the daggers into the room herself, saying that she would be ashamed to be as cowardly as Macbeth. As she leaves, Macbeth hears a mysterious knocking. The portentous sound frightens him, and he asks desperately, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand?" 2:2.58a59. As Lady Macbeth re-enters the hall, the knocking comes again, and then a third time. She leads her husband back to the bedchamber, where he can wash off the blood. "A little water clears us of this deed," she tells him. How easy it is then. 2:2.65a66. A porter stumbles through the hallway to answer the knocking, grumbling comically about the noise and mocking whoever is on the other side of the door. He compares himself to a porter at the gates of hell and asks, "Who's there?" "I, the name of Beelzebub." 2.3.3. Macduff and Lennox enter, and Macduff complains about the porter's slow response to his knock. The porter says that he was up late carousing and rambles on humorously about the effects of alcohol, which he says provokes red noses, sleepiness, and urination. He adds that drink also provokes an unprovoked lechery. It inclines one to be lustful but takes away the ability to have sex. February 3, 2027. Macbeth enters, and Macduff asks him if the king is awake, saying that Duncan asked to see him early that morning. In short, clipped sentences, Macbeth says that Duncan is still asleep. He offers to take Macduff to the king. As Macduff enters the king's chamber, Lennox describes the storms that raged the previous night, asserting that he cannot remember anything like it in all his years. With a cry of "Oh horror, horror, horror," Macduff comes running from the room, shouting that the king has been murdered. February 3, 1959. Macbeth and Lennox rush in to look, while Lady Macbeth appears and expresses her horror that such a deed could be done under her roof. General chaos ensues as the other nobles and their servants come streaming in. As Macbeth and Lennox emerge from the bedroom, Malcolm and Donalbain arrive on the scene. They are told that their father has been killed, most likely by his chamberlains, who were found with bloody daggers. Macbeth declares that in his rage he has killed the chamberlains. Macduff seems suspicious of those new deaths, which Macbeth explains by saying that his fury at Duncan's death was so powerful that he could not restrain himself. Lady Macbeth suddenly faints, and both Macduff and Banquo call for someone to attend to her. Malcolm and Donalbain whisper to each other that they are not safe, since whoever killed their father will probably try to kill them next. Lady Macbeth is taken away, while Banquo and Macbeth rally the lords to meet and discuss the murder. Duncan's sons resolve to flee the court. Malcolm declares that he will go south to England, and Donalbain will hasten to Ireland. Ross, Athane, walks outside the castle with an old man. They discuss the strange and ominous happenings of the past few days. It is daytime, but dark outside. Last Tuesday, an owl killed a falcon and Duncan's beautiful, well-trained horses behaved wildly and ate one another. Macduff emerges from the castle and tells Ross that Macbeth has been made king by the other lords and that he now rides to Scone to be crowned. Macduff adds that the chamberlains seemed the most likely murderers and that they may have been paid off by someone to kill Duncan. Suspicion has now fallen on the two princes, Malcolm and Donalbain, because they have fled the scene. Macduff returns to his home at Fife, and Ross departs for Scone to see the new king's coronation. In the royal palace at Forres, Banquo paces and thinks about the coronation of Macbeth and the prophecies of the Weird Sisters. The witches foretold that Macbeth would be king and that Banquo's line would eventually sit on the throne. If the first prophecy came true, Banquo thinks, feeling the stirring of ambition, why not the second? Macbeth enters, attired as king. He is followed by Lady Macbeth, now his queen, and the court. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth ask Banquo to attend the feast they will host that night. Banquo accepts their invitation and says that he plans to go for a ride on his horse for the afternoon. Macbeth mentions that they should discuss the problem of Malcolm and Dawn Albane. The brothers have fled from Scotland and may be plotting against his crown. Banquo departs, and Macbeth dismisses his court. He is left alone in the hall with a single servant, to whom he speaks about some men who have come to see him. Macbeth asks if the men are still waiting and orders that they be fetched. Once the servant has gone, Macbeth begins a soliloquy. He muses on the subject of Banquo, reflecting that his old friend is the only man in Scotland whom he fears. He notes that if the witch's prophecy is true, his will be a fruitless crown, by which he means that he will not have an heir. March 1, 1962. The murder of Duncan, which weighs so heavily on his conscience, may have simply cleared the way for Banquo's sons to overthrow Macbeth's own family. The servant re-enters with Macbeth's two visitors. Macbeth reminds the two men, who are murderers he has hired, of a conversation he had with them the day before, in which he chronicled the wrongs Banquo had done them in the past. He asks if they are angry and manly enough to take revenge on Banquo. They reply that they are, and Macbeth accepts their promise that they will murder his former friend. Macbeth reminds the murderers that Flens must be killed along with his father and tells them to wait within the castle for his command. Elsewhere in the castle, Lady Macbeth expresses despair and sends a servant to fetch her husband. Macbeth enters and tells his wife that he too is discontented, saying that his mind is full of scorpions. March 2, 1937. He feels that the business that they began by killing Duncan is not yet complete because there are still threats to the throne that must be eliminated. Macbeth tells his wife that he has planned a deed of dreadful note for Banquo and Flens and urges her to be jovial and kind to Banquo during the evening's feast, to lure their next victim into a false sense of security. March 2, 1945. It is dusk, and the two murderers, now joined by a third, linger in a wooded park outside the palace. Banquo and Flens approach on their horses and dismount. They light a torch, and the murderers set upon them. The murderers kill Banquo, who dies urging his son to flee and to avenge his death. One of the murderers extinguishes the torch, and in the darkness, Flens escapes. The murderers leave with Banquo's body to find Macbeth and tell him what has happened. On stage stands a table heaped with a feast. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth enter as king and queen, followed by their court, whom they bid welcome. As Macbeth walks among the company, the first murderer appears at the doorway. Macbeth speaks to him for a moment, learning that Banquo is dead and that Flens has escaped. The news of Flens's escape angers Macbeth. If only Flens had died, he muses, his throne would have been secure. Instead, the worm that's fled, hath nature that in time will venom breed. 3.4.28.829. Returning to his guests, Macbeth goes to sit at the head of the royal table but finds Banquo's ghost sitting in his chair. Horror-struck, Macbeth speaks to the ghost, which is invisible to the rest of the company. Lady Macbeth makes excuses for her husband, saying that he occasionally has such visions and that the guests should simply ignore his behavior. Then she speaks to Macbeth, questioning his manhood and urging him to snap out of his trance. The ghost disappears, and Macbeth recovers, telling his company, "I have a strange infirmity which is nothing, to those that know me." 3.4.85.86. As he offers a toast to the company, however, Banquo's spectre reappears and shocks Macbeth into further reckless outbursts. Continuing to make excuses for her husband, Lady Macbeth sends the alarmed guests out of the room as the ghost vanishes again. Macbeth mutters that blood will have blood and tells Lady Macbeth that he has heard from a servant spy that Macbeth intends to keep away from court, behavior that verges on treason. 3.4.121. He says that he will visit the witches again tomorrow in the hopes of learning more about the future and about who may be plotting against him. He resolves to do whatever is necessary to keep his throne, declaring, "I am in blood, stepped in so far that, should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er." 3.4.135.137. Lady Macbeth says that he needs sleep, and they retire to their bed. Upon the stormy heath, the witches meet with Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft. Hecate scolds them for meddling in the business of Macbeth without consulting her, but declares that she will take over as supervisor of the mischief. She says that when Macbeth comes the next day, as they know he will, they must summon visions and spirits whose messages will fill him with a false sense of security and draw him on to his confusion. March 5, 2029. Hecate vanishes, and the witches go to prepare their charms. That night, somewhere in Scotland, Lennox walks with another lord, discussing what has happened to the kingdom. Banquo's murder has been officially blamed on Flens, who has fled. Nevertheless, both men suspect Macbeth, whom they call a tyrant, in the murders of Duncan and Banquo. The lord tells Lennox that Macduff has gone to England, where he will join Malcolm in pitting with England's King Edward for aid. News of those plots has prompted Macbeth to prepare for war. Lennox and the lord express their hope that Malcolm and Macduff will be successful and that their actions can save Scotland from Macbeth. In a dark cavern, a bubbling cauldron hisses and spits, and the three witches suddenly appear on stage. They circle the cauldron, chanting spells and adding bizarre ingredients to their stew: eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog. 4.1.14a15. Hecate materializes and compliments the witches on their work. One of the witches then chants, "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes." 4.1.61a62. In fulfillment of the witch's prediction, Macbeth enters. He asks the witches to reveal the truth of their prophecies to him. To answer his questions, they summon horrible apparitions, each of which offers a prediction to allay Macbeth's fears. First, a floating head warns him to beware Macduff. Macbeth says that he has already guessed as much. Then a bloody child appears and tells him that none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. 4.1.96a97. Next, a crowned child holding a tree tells him that he is safe until Branamwood moves to Dunsinane Hill. Finally, a procession of 8 crowned kings walks by, the last carrying a mirror. Banquo's ghost walks at the end of the line. Macbeth demands to know the meaning of this final vision, but the witches perform a mad dance and then vanish. Lennox enters and tells Macbeth that Macduff has fled to England. Macbeth resolves to send murderers to capture Macduff's castle and kill Macduff's wife and children. At Macduff's castle, Lady Macduff accosts Ross, demanding to know why her husband has fled. She feels betrayed. Ross insists that she trusts her husband's judgment and then regretfully departs. Once he is gone, Lady Macduff tells her son that his father is dead, but the little boy perceptively argues that he is not. Suddenly, a messenger hurries in, warning Lady Macduff that she is in danger and urging her to flee. Lady Macduff protests, arguing that she has done no wrong. A group of murderers then enters. When one of them denounces Macduff, Macduff's son calls the murderer a liar, and the murderer stabs him. Lady Macduff turns and runs, and the pack of killers chases after her. Outside King Edward's palace, Malcolm speaks with Macduff, telling him that he does not trust him since he has left his family in Scotland and may be secretly working for Macbeth. To determine whether Macduff is trustworthy, Malcolm rambles on about his vices. He admits that he wonders whether he is fit to be king since he claims to be lustful, greedy, and violent. At first, Macduff politely disagrees with his future king, but eventually, Macduff cannot keep himself from crying out, "Oh Scotland, Scotland." 4.3.101. Macduff's loyalty to Scotland leads him to agree that Malcolm is not fit to govern Scotland and perhaps not even to live. In giving voice to his disparagement, Macduff has passed Malcolm's test of loyalty. Malcolm then retracts the lies he has put forth about his supposed shortcomings and embraces Macduff as an ally. A doctor appears briefly and mentions that a crew of wretched souls waits for King Edward so they may be cured. 4.3.142. When the doctor leaves, Malcolm explains to Macduff that King Edward has a miraculous power to cure disease. Ross enters. He has just arrived from Scotland and tells Macduff that his wife and children are well. He urges Malcolm to return to his country, listing the woes that have befallen Scotland since Macbeth took the crown. Malcolm says that he will return with 10,000 soldiers lent to him by the English king. Then, breaking down, Ross confesses to Macduff that Macbeth has murdered his wife and children. Macduff is crushed with grief. Malcolm urges him to turn his grief to anger, and Macduff assures him that he will inflict revenge upon Macbeth. At night, in the king's palace at Dunsinane, a doctor and a gentlewoman discuss Lady Macbeth's strange habit of sleepwalking. Suddenly, Lady Macbeth enters a trance with a candle in her hand. Bemoaning the murders of Lady Macduff and Banquo, she seems to see blood on her hands and claims that nothing will ever wash it off. She leaves, and the doctor and gentlewoman marvel at her descent into madness. Outside the castle, a group of Scottish lords discusses the military situation. The English army approaches, led by Malcolm, and the Scottish army will meet them near Burnham Wood, apparently to join forces with them. The tyrant, as Lennox and the other lords call Macbeth, has fortified Dunsinane Castle and is making his military preparations in a mad rage. Macbeth strides into the hall of Dunsinane with the doctor and his attendants, boasting proudly that he has nothing to fear from the English army or Malcolm, since none of woman born can harm him. April 1, 1996, and since he will rule securely, Burnham would remove to Dunsinane. 5.3.2. He calls his servant Seton, who confirms that an army of 10,000 Englishmen approaches the castle. Macbeth insists upon wearing his armor, though the battle is still some time off. The doctor tells the king that Lady Macbeth is kept from rest by thick-coming fancies, and Macbeth orders him to cure her of her delusions. May 3, 1940. In the country near Burnham Wood, Malcolm talks with the English Lord Stewart and his officers about Macbeth's plan to defend the fortified castle. They decide that each soldier should cut down a bough of the forest and carry it in front of him as they march to the castle, thereby disguising their numbers. Within the castle, Macbeth blusteringly orders that banners be hung and boasts that his castle will repel the enemy. A woman's cry is heard, and Seton appears to tell Macbeth that the queen is dead. Shocked, Macbeth speaks numbly about the passage of time and declares famously that life is a tale, told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. 5.5.25.827. A messenger enters with astonishing news. The trees of Burnham Wood are advancing toward Dunsinane. Enraged and terrified, Macbeth recalls the prophecy that said he could not die till Burnham would move to Dunsinane. Resignedly, he declares that he is tired of the sun and that at least he will die fighting. Outside the castle, the battle commences. Malcolm orders the English soldiers to throw down their bows and draw their swords. On the battlefield, Macbeth strikes those around him vigorously and insolently because no man born of a woman can harm him. He slays Lord Steward's son and disappears into the fray. Macduff emerges and searches the chaos for Macbeth, whom he longs to cut down personally. He dives again into the battle. Malcolm and Steward emerge and enter the castle. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Macbeth at last encounters Macduff. They fight, and when Macbeth insists that he is invincible because of the witch's prophecy, Macduff tells Macbeth that he was not of woman born, but rather from his mother's womb, untimely ripped. 5.8.15a16. Macbeth suddenly fears for his life, but he declares that he will not surrender. To kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet, and to be baited with the rabble's curse. 5.8.28.829. They exit fighting. Malcolm and Steward walk together into the castle, which they have now effectively captured. Ross tells Steward that his son is dead. Macduff emerges with Macbeth's head in his hand and proclaims Malcolm King of Scotland. Malcolm declares that all his Thanes will be made earls. According to the English system of the peerage, they will be the first such lords in Scottish history. Cursing Macbeth and his fiend-like queen, Malcolm calls all those around him his friends and invites them all to see him crowned at Scone, May 8, 1935.